Well guys, it finally happened. The volatile bug that we've been using with crazy amounts of damage with Retrofit Escapade has been fixed. And with hotfix 6.3.0.4, Bungie fixed an issue where volatile detonations triggered at higher than expected cadence. And it's true, no longer can you get those multiple rapid back-to-back volatile explosions. It's essentially back to what it's supposed to be, where a volatile explosion happens once every second if you're consistently hitting the specific damage threshold to proc said explosion. So now, when you lay on the trigger with Retrofit Escapade and volatile rounds, you'll see the explosion trigger just once per second. The same goes for really any weapon with volatile rounds, if you're meeting the necessary damage. Now, we made an entire breakdown video and essentially went into volatile, retrofit, why we were reaching the damage numbers that we were reaching, and our conclusion was we felt like a nerf was coming, and that it did. And it essentially led us to dive right back into the numbers to see what exactly changed. What did Bungie do to fix this bug? And did volatile overall take a hit in the process? Well, I really wish it was that simple. In our I Owe You a God Roll video that was posted just a few days ago, we briefly went over volatile, how it worked, but now we've got a lot more data and a few corrections to make since pretty much everything in that video has changed. To start it off, let's remind everybody exactly what volatile actually does. The in-game description of the volatile verb reads, the target is afflicted with unstable void energy and will explode upon taking additional damage. Now, what's not mentioned here is that this explosion only happens when a set amount of damage is applied to a target afflicted with volatile. Now, this explosion also occurs when a volatile target dies, which is literally mentioned nowhere in the game description. Volatile rounds gives your void weapons the ability to apply volatile to enemies, meaning when you have volatile rounds procced, one singular bullet from a void weapon will make a target volatile. Then you can keep firing that weapon and eventually you'll proc a volatile explosion if said enemy takes the required set amount of damage, or if they die while volatile. You'd also make an enemy volatile with volatile rounds, then switch off to a non-void weapon and do the same thing, because you just need the void weapon to apply volatile, but any additional damage to a volatile target can proc the explosion. So after the hotfix went live, we wanted to make sure that the damage threshold to proc the explosion hadn't changed, because the theory that we have is that Bungie increased how much damage you need to apply to a volatile target for the damage to trigger. Before, Retrofit was pumping out so much damage and so fast that it was bugging everything out. So we think they just upped the amount of damage needed to essentially bug out volatile. Now, the reason why we think this is because this is exactly what they did back in Season the Haunted when Wavesplitter was also bugging out volatile just like Retrofit was. They pushed the damage required for volatile to bug out to the point where Wavesplitter couldn't do it anymore. Hence why we can't replicate it now. And probably to their surprise, another weapon was actually able to hit that threshold, which of course is Retrofit. So we go to testing and found some interesting things that we hadn't noticed before. In that same Retrofit video, we talked about the set damage you need to deal before a volatile explosion occurs. We tested a Void Auto Rifle and a Void SMG, and both of them procced an explosion around the 7,000 to 7,500 threshold, so we assumed that was the answer. The explosion damage was also consistent at 7,765 damage. Now, either we're a bit off here because we didn't test a higher variety of weapons, or something changed with the hotfix, because now, post-hotfix, we're getting a ton of different damage values. Also, it changes depending on the type of weapon you're using. To show you what we mean, here's some examples of our testing. Everything was tested at Carl with no damage buffs or perks active. The only thing we're using is Falcon so that we can get volatile rounds easily. And in our numbers, we aren't counting the shot that makes Carl volatile. We aren't counting that initial shot towards the damage required for the explosion to occur. Only every shot after the first. Now the Perseus D Scout Rifle deals 4,618 damage per crit and triggers the volatile explosion after 3 crits, meaning it requires Perseus to deal more than 7,000 damage that we originally thought was the threshold, because 2 crits is 9,236, and that doesn't proc the explosion even though that's higher than 7,000. Now you turn around and try the Duraka Scout Rifle, and 3 crits with that is 9,207 damage, and that too doesn't trigger the explosion either. And we saw these numbers and we're like, okay, yeah, they definitely changed something. It's requiring much more damage to get the explosion off, until we went and tried other weapon types. For example, the Gnawing Hunger auto rifle, it takes 8 crits to proc the explosion, landing it a bit over the original threshold of 7,500. Same with 7 Seraph sidearm, 3 crits is about 7,600 damage, and it too procs the explosion. Some machine guns, same thing, right around the original threshold. So what is actually going on here? Has Volatile always worked like this, and we didn't test enough archetypes to realize? Because the numbers we have, it seems like the damage you need to deal in order to proc the Volatile explosion depends on the type of weapon that you're using. Now, we do have a theory here that this is actually how it's always worked. I like to believe that if this was part of Bungie's hotfix change, that they would have included it in the patch notes. It just feels like too big of a change not to bring up the details. Now, as the test went on and we started gathering even more data and seeing more inconsistencies, the only conclusion we came to is that it seems like harder hitting weapon types have a larger explosion damage threshold versus that of lower damage dealing weapon types. For example, in our testing, SMGs, auto rifles, and sidearms seem to land around that 7,500 damage mark before an explosion happens. The scout rifles and bows, as well as machine guns, have a much higher threshold. So did Volatile all around just get hit with a nerf with this hotfix? I don't know, guys. If the damage threshold before was a steady 7,000 damage across all weapons like we originally thought, then yes, there has been a nerf. But if that was the case, I feel like there would be more people talking about it on YouTube or maybe even on Reddit, possibly on Twitter. Someone somewhere would have noticed this. And if there was a direct nerf, I would like to believe Bungie would have mentioned that in the hotfix. So with all that being said, after going over exactly what Volatile is, how it works, and how to get the explosions happening, and what our math has told us, we want to go over the best void weapons to pair with Volatile rounds. What weapons actually benefit the most now? What weapons can proc the explosion the quickest? So let's do that right now. Now, the general consensus here is that most weapons will always take multiple shots to trigger a Volatile explosion. Now, there are a few select weapons that can apply Volatile and trigger the explosion in one single shot. We like to call these one-shot Volatiles. These weapons aren't really the best to use, but we're gonna list them here. They include Telesto, Deathbringer, Two-Tailed Fox, and Leviathan's Breath. All of these work as one-shot Volatiles because they have multiple hits of damage via a single shot. Telesto deals impact damage, which applies the Volatile, then the exploding bolts trigger it. Deathbringer has a bunch of projectiles, so one of them actually applies it while the others triggers. Leviathan's Breath has a concussive blast after the arrow hits and then will trigger. And the Void Rocket of Two-Tailed Fox applies it while the Solar Rocket triggers it. Remember that the Volatile explosion always deals the same amount of damage no matter the weapon. This amount is 7,765 damage, which is why depending on the weapon you're using, it has diminishing returns. If you're triggering the explosion with something like a rocket launcher, 7,765 damage isn't really contributing that much. Now, there might be other one-shots out there. There might even be legendaries that can do this as well, since all that's in the way is a set damage threshold. And there's a possibility that weapon damage perks plus some damage buffs can get you to that threshold with just one hit. But in our testing, it seems to be that you're definitely in need of a weapon that hits multiple times. A hit to apply and hits to trigger. So if the one-shots that we just talked about aren't the best weapons to use, what are? The next best thing are weapons that take one shot to apply Volatile, then one shot to trigger the explosion. Things like bows, which takes 2 crits. You've got Imperial Needle, Under Your Skin, which is craftable. Bows with explosive arrowhead are even better as they only take 2 body shots to trigger instead of requiring crits for the 2 shot. And you can actually get explosive arrowhead with Under Your Skin. Void Glaives, Void Wave Frames, and Void Swords also take 2 shots to work. First shot to apply, second to trigger. Enigma, Edge of Action, Dead Messenger, Deafening Whisper, Falling Guillotine, Razor's Edge, and Black Talent. Do note though, only the energy blasts from glaives count here. Just poking the glaives doesn't actually apply Volatile or trigger the explosion. But anything that hits multiple times is going to help you reach the damage threshold faster and or enable you to just hit to the body. So things like Explosive Payload is good right alongside Explosive Arrowhead. Now, we already mentioned that you're not really getting a ton of damage from Volatile with things like rocket launchers, but any Void Rocket with Lasting Impression will be able to do the same thing, apply and trigger in one shot if you hit the target directly. Now, Cluster Bombs can also do this, but in our testing, it is inconsistent. If you're alongside someone who's using Gjallarhorn, your Void Rocket will apply while the Wolfpack rounds trigger. Now, machine guns are still good to use, like Retrofit, and they can still do decent damage with things like Target Lock, 4 times the Charm, and Volatile. So I wouldn't say the fix outright killed the gun, but in our damage testing, it used to match or even exceed Grand Overture, and now it is coming in significantly less than what Grand Overture does. And again, we actually missed like half the volley on that second shot of Grand Overture. So Grand Overture actually has even more damage than this. With that being said though, Retrofit is still a decent machine gun, and it's craftable, and I would still advise you to get it. Now let's quickly touch on some exotics that that can pair very nicely with volatile rounds. The Monarque is really good here. The burst of the poison that spreads out after the precision hit will spread volatile to nearby enemies. The volatile explosions will help trigger Unrelenting, which is the perk you get when you have the catalyst. On top of that, it counters overloads intrinsically. Lorentz Driver is also an interesting choice. You don't see many people rocking Lorentz anymore in PvE or inside of PvP, but its EM anomaly trait causes precision hits to pull in nearby targets and detonate. So volatile rounds will cause that detonation to spread volatile as well. Now we talked about Telesto already, but the synergy there is actually really good. Its Harbinger's Pulse trait also reloads your equipped energy and kinetic weapons when you get multi-kills with Telesto. Volatile rounds definitely helps with activating that. Now Wavesplitter is also a powerhouse with volatile rounds. We made a build a while back during Season the Haunted when Wavesplitter was bugging out those explosions, similar to what we recently saw with Retrofit. Now it's not doing that, but you can still dish out insane damage. The recent Wavesplitter rework allows Wavesplitter to get super buffed upon picking up an orb, as well as suppress, and volatile rounds just takes it to the next level and allows for some great build opportunities surrounding orb pickup and orb generation. And considering suppression will actually be a counter to champions next season, we did an entire breakdown video of all the weapons you should be using next season that can naturally counter champions in-game content. Then we have Graviton Lance, another superb pairing here. Graviton Lance was already good with volatile rounds. We knew this when Witch Queen launched, and I messed around with it back then, and that's still the case today. Its perk Cosmology already causes enemies to detonate and spawn void projectiles that tracks targets. Volatile rounds just makes this weapon more deadly by adding onto those kabloomies that are already happening. Now for all you guys that like Ruinous Effigy, yes, there's some synergy here for sure. Volatile rounds will cause any attack with the void ball to cause volatile. Even with the guard attack, as you drain enemies, this will cause them to explode. Not saying it's meta, but it does work and it's an option. And then we have the obvious pick, Collective Obligation. This is going to be for all you Titans and Warlocks, as well as Hunters that don't want to use Gerfalcons. As long as you can proc volatile once, you'll be able to consistently spread that volatile around, as well as any other void debuffs by using Collective Obligation's Void Leech perk, which can essentially chain endlessly as long as you have enemies to shoot. Now keep in mind guys, for those that really like explosions, these volatile explosions, and you're looking to chain them as much as you possibly can, if you actually go to your Void subclass and tack on Echo of Expulsion, it states that Void ability Final Blows cause targets to explode. You can actually get double with the explosion with this. So the volatile explosions and Echo of Explosion causing a secondary explosion. So this is a very passive way of buffing every volatile build you could be using. Now with all that being said, it is much easier for Hunters to make use of volatile and volatile rounds and everything we talked about in this video because of course Gerfalcons. But I do want to point out that this isn't the end all be all list for best weapons to use with volatile rounds. This is just what we found from our extensive, almost 2-week long team-wide testing. More essentially, what we wanted to come to the conclusion on was volatile actually nerfed. Some weapons we can actually say yes, it has been changed. Things like Fighting Lion was changed. It no longer immediately detonates from a single shot. Retrofit was 100% nerfed as it was proccing those volatile explosions due to its rate of fire over and over again. So like the hotfix said, volatile detonations that were triggering at a higher expected cadence was fixed. Now I'm sure something may have actually snuck through, but with that being said, by no means does this mean that volatile isn't still worth building into. There is a host of exotics that take full advantage of volatile. Gerfalcons is still a fantastic exotic to use for all void builds. The only thing you're not getting after this hotfix is that ability to have insane DPS with things like retrofits. And I gotta say guys, it was beautiful. I enjoyed it. We shredded Kaido multiple times, and just watching boss's health completely disintegrate. We've accomplished this before. I mean, things like Boom Strat and other things, but you had to jump through hoops. Gerfalcons and Retrofit, all you had to do was dodge and instantly shred everything. So it's no surprise to see that this was nerfed. With that being said though guys, if you notice a big change with say your build or your specific setup, feel free to comment it down below. We do have a Discord. We also have a build section, and in that build section, if you actually have a weapon that seems to be performing perhaps better or even worse post hotfix 6.3.0.4, feel free to come by guys, comment it, and also at me about it. I'm definitely interested. Well, fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.